On a Tuesday morning in the late October of 1987, Dale Mercer stood on the shoulder of County Road 14 in Hardin County, Iowa, and watched his entire winter schedule dissolve into the mud. 3 hours earlier, his best truck, a 1983 Peterbilt 359 loaded with 47,000 pounds of soybeans, had drifted 6 inches too far to the right on a rain-softened shoulder and gone down. Not a dramatic rollover, not a collision, just a slow, inevitable lean, and then the whole rig settled into the ditch like a tired man sitting down in a chair he had no intention of leaving. The truck was upright, the driver was fine, and the beans were still in the trailer. But the rear tandems were buried to the axle housings in black Iowa clay, and the front steer axle had followed them down until the frame rails were resting on soft ground. Dale had been running Mercer Grain Hauling for 11 years. He had built the company from one borrowed truck and a handshake deal with a co-op in Eldora to a fleet of 7 semis and contracts with 4 of the largest grain elevators in Hardin County. He was 38 years old, and he had never once missed a delivery window. Not once. And now he was standing in the rain, watching his best truck disappear into the earth. Let me tell you about what Dale tried first, because you need to understand the scope of what he was up against before you can understand why what happened next mattered as much as it did. He called Benson's wrecker service out of Iowa Falls within the first 20 minutes. Gary Benson showed up 40 minutes later in a heavy-duty rotator wrecker, a 1985 Century 150, 50 tons of rated capacity, the biggest thing Benson's owned. Gary hooked up, took the strain, and the wrecker's rear wheels spun on the wet asphalt for 30 seconds before Gary lifted off the throttle and climbed down from the cab, shaking his head. The ground under the shoulder had turned to something close to soup. Every time the wrecker pulled, the Peterbilt moved, but not up and not forward. It moved deeper. The suction of that clay was something Gary said he hadn't seen in 15 years of recovery work. He told Dale he needed a second unit and a crib of timber to get purchase on the shoulder, and he'd be back in the morning. That was Tuesday. The morning came and went. Gary came back with his second wrecker, a smaller 35-ton unit, and they rigged a tandem pull. The Peterbilt moved 8 inches toward the road before the lead wrecker's outriggers punched through the shoulder, and the whole operation stopped cold while Gary's crew spent 2 hours digging them out. Dale stood in the rain and did the math in his head. He had 4 delivery windows that week. He had a driver sitting idle. He had a truck that wasn't moving, and he had a wrecker company that was starting to look at the job the way a man looks at a bill he can't pay, with a kind of respectful, helpless distance. By Wednesday afternoon, Gary Benson told Dale the honest truth. He said, "I can get it out, but it's going to take a week. I need to bring in a crane from Des Moines. I need to let the shoulder dry out, and I need to build a proper crib under my outriggers before I can get purchase." A week. Dale stood there with rain running off the brim of his cap and thought about the $2,400 per day in delayed delivery penalties he was looking at under his elevator contracts. He thought about the $18,000 in beans sitting in that trailer that he couldn't deliver and couldn't unload. He thought about the driver he was paying to sit in a motel in Iowa Falls. A week meant $16,800 in penalties alone, before you counted the crane rental, the crib materials, Gary's labor, and whatever damage the truck had taken sitting in wet clay for 7 days. Dale was looking at a number north of $30,000 and climbing. That's when he drove to the co-op to make phone calls and ran into Everett Hassel standing at the parts counter buying a set of grease fittings. Let me tell you about Everett Hassel, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did. Everett was 71 years old that October. He had farmed the same 320 acres in the northeast corner of Hardin County his entire life. The same ground his father had broken in 1919. The same ground his grandfather had walked behind a team of horses before the First World War. He was a short man, maybe 5'8", with hands that looked like they had been carved out of walnut root, brown and knotted and permanently stained with grease in the creases of his knuckles no matter how hard he scrubbed. He wore the same thing every day of his working life: dark green work pants, a canvas barn coat with a tear in the left elbow that he had stitched closed with baling twine sometime in the mid-1970s and never replaced, and a John Deere cap so old that the green had faded to the color of old grass in August. He had been married to the same woman, Ruth, for 49 years. He had 2 sons, both of whom farmed ground within 5 miles of the home place. He had never owned a new car. He had never taken a vacation that wasn't a drive to visit his sister in Waterloo. He was, by every external measure, a man who had lived his entire life within a radius of about 30 miles and was perfectly content with that fact. But Everett Hassel had something that none of Dale Mercer's wreckers had, and it had been sitting in his machine shed for 53 years. Let me tell you about that machine, because the machine is the whole story. In 1934, Everett's father, Harold Hassel, had paid $1,850 for a Caterpillar 30, a crawler tractor built in Peoria, Illinois, that weighed just over 9,000 pounds and ran on a 4-cylinder gasoline engine that produced 30 drawbar horsepower and just under 36 belt horsepower. Harold had bought it off a farm that was being sold at auction during the worst of the Depression, from a family that had lost everything and was selling what they could to pay what they owed. Harold had paid what he could, which wasn't much, and he had driven that machine home 22 miles on its steel tracks because he couldn't afford a trailer. The Caterpillar 30 was not a new machine, even in 1934. It had been built in 1928 and had 6 years of hard use on it when Harold brought it home. But Harold was a man who believed that a tool properly maintained would outlast any man who owned it, and he maintained that crawler the way a surgeon maintains his instruments, with attention, with patience, and with the understanding that the day would come when it would matter. Harold passed the machine to Everett in 1961 when his hands got too bad for the work. Everett had kept it running for 26 years after that, replacing what wore out, rebuilding what couldn't be replaced, fabricating parts on his own lathe when the dealer told him the parts didn't exist anymore. By 1987, that Caterpillar 30 was 59 years old, and Everett Hassel could tell you the history of every bolt in it. The machine had one characteristic that separated it from everything Dale Mercer had tried. The Caterpillar 30 had a drawbar pull rating of approximately 5,600 pounds. Not impressive by 1987 standards, but it had something the modern wreckers didn't have. It had steel track cleats, 14 inches wide, that could grip wet clay the way a hand grips a rope, and it had a final drive gear reduction so severe that at full throttle in its lowest gear, the machine moved at less than 1 mile per hour. Not fast, not powerful in the way that word usually means, but absolutely, mechanically, inexorably relentless. You could not stall it with a load the way you could stall a modern hydraulic system that protected itself from overload. The Caterpillar 30 did not protect itself from overload. It had no computer, No pressure relief valve, no automatic cutout. It simply pulled until either the load moved or something broke, and in 59 years of operation, Harold and Everett Hassel had never broken it. Everett had been driving past County Road 14 every morning that week on his way to check his cattle. He had seen Dale's truck in the ditch on Tuesday. He had seen the wreckers come and go on Wednesday. He had watched, from the cab of his pickup, the way the ground was behaving, the way the clay was acting not like soil but like a slow fluid, flowing around anything that pushed into it rather than giving way. He had not said anything to anyone because Everett Hassel was not a man who offered opinions he hadn't been asked for, but he had been thinking about it. And when he saw Dale Mercer walk through the door of the co-op on Wednesday afternoon with the expression of a man who had run out of ideas, Everett set down his grease fittings and said quietly, "I heard you've got a truck in the ditch on 14. Dale looked at him. He knew Everett the way everyone in Hardin County knew Everett, as a fixture, as a neighbor, as the man with the old place northeast of town. He said yes, he did, and it was a bad situation, and the wrecker company was telling him a week. Everett nodded slowly. He said, "I've got something that might move it." Dale, in the state he was in, said, "What have you got?" And Everett told him about the Caterpillar. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation so desperate that you were willing to try anything, and then, when someone offered to help, your first instinct was still to say no? That's where Dale Mercer was, and that's what he did. Dale's first reaction was not gratitude. Dale's first reaction was a look that started at Everett's barn coat and traveled up to his faded cap and arrived at a polite but unmistakable skepticism. He said, "Everett, I appreciate it, but I've got a 47,000-pound load in that trailer. I need a crane from Des Moines." Everett said he understood. Dale said the ground was too soft for anything to get purchase. Everett said he knew. Dale said he needed serious horsepower to break that suction. And that's when Everett said the thing that would stay with Dale Mercer for the rest of his life. He said, "Dale, you don't need horsepower. You need pull. There's a difference." Dale stared at him. He said, "Everett, that machine is what, 50 years old?" Everett said, 59. Dale said, "I've got 50 tons of wrecker that can't move it." Everett said, "Your wrecker is pushing against the ground to pull the truck. My machine is pulling against the ground. There's a difference." Dale said, with a laugh that was not entirely unkind but was not entirely kind either, "Everett, I'm not sure a Depression-era tractor's going to do what 2 modern wreckers couldn't." Everett picked up his grease fittings from the counter and put them in his coat pocket. He said, "Probably not. But you've got a week to wait either way. I can be there in the morning." Dale said fine, not because he believed it would work. He said fine the way a man says fine when he has nothing left to lose, and someone is offering to at least do something. He said fine, and he went back to his truck, and he drove home, and he called his wife and told her he was going to watch an old man try to pull a semi out of a ditch with a tractor that was older than television. The next morning, Thursday, Everett Hassel arrived at County Road 14 at 7 o'clock. He came down the road on the Caterpillar 30 under its own power, moving at about 4 miles per hour on the asphalt, the steel tracks ringing and clanking on the pavement with a sound like a slow, deliberate bell. The machine was painted the original Caterpillar gray, not the modern highway yellow, because the Caterpillar 30 predated the yellow paint scheme by several years. The paint was worn in places and touched up in others, and the whole machine had the look of something that had been maintained rather than preserved. Not a museum piece, but a working tool that happened to be very old. Behind it, on a flatbed trailer pulled by Everett's pickup, driven by his son Robert, came 200 feet of 3/4-inch grade 70 chain and a set of snatch blocks that Everett had assembled on his shop floor the night before. Dale Mercer was standing on the shoulder with Gary Benson when Everett arrived. Gary watched the Caterpillar come down the road and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Is that a Cat 30? Dale said yes. Gary said, "Everett Hassel's machine?" Dale said yes. Gary crossed his arms and looked at the Peterbilt in the ditch and looked at the Caterpillar and said, "I don't want to say anything discouraging, but that machine has maybe a third of the drawbar pull my smaller unit has." Dale said he knew. Gary said, "I'm just saying." Dale said he knew. Everett climbed down from the Caterpillar and walked to the edge of the ditch without speaking to either of them. He stood there for 2 or 3 minutes, looking at the truck, looking at the ground, looking at the angle of the frame rails and the depth of the tandems and the way the clay had flowed around the tires and hardened slightly overnight. He walked around to the far side of the ditch and looked at the truck from that angle. He walked back. He said to Dale, "I'm going to need to change your angle of pull about 30 degrees. Dale said, "Whatever you need." Everett nodded and walked back to the Caterpillar. Let me tell you about the next 3 hours, because they are the reason this story is still being told in Hardin County 30 years later. Everett did not rush. That was the first thing Dale noticed, and it was the thing that either impressed him or frustrated him, depending on which moment you asked. Everett spent 45 minutes on rigging alone. He and Robert laid the chain out along the ditch bank, measuring angles, repositioning the snatch blocks to create a mechanical advantage that changed the effective direction of pull by exactly the 30 degrees Everett had calculated. He crawled under the Peterbilt's frame to hook the chain to the rear crossmember rather than the trailer hitch, because he said the hitch would transfer the load wrong. He packed the area around the rear tandem with the timber cribbing he had brought, not to give the tires purchase, but to prevent the frame from sinking further when the pull began and the suction broke. He checked every chain link in the first 40 feet by hand, running his fingers along each one the way a doctor runs his fingers along a spine, feeling for anything that didn't belong. Gary Benson's crew had gathered on the shoulder by this point, 5 men in total, and they were watching with the particular silence of professionals who are watching someone do something they don't entirely understand and aren't sure whether to respect or dismiss. One of Gary's younger drivers said, under his breath but not quietly enough, "This ought to be good." Gary said nothing. At 8:53 in the morning, Everett climbed back onto the Caterpillar. He sat there for a moment, not doing anything, just sitting. Robert told Dale later that his father always did that. Sat for a moment before he started a hard pull, not praying exactly, but something adjacent to it, a kind of gathering. Then Everett engaged the clutch, moved the machine forward until the chain came taut, and stopped. He got down and checked the angle of the chain against the truck frame. He adjusted one snatch block by about 6 inches. He got back on. He engaged the clutch again. For a long moment, nothing seemed to happen. The chain went from taut to rigid. The Caterpillar's tracks pressed into the clay of the road shoulder and held, not spinning, not churning, just holding, the 14-inch steel cleats finding purchase in the wet ground the way a hand finds the rung of a ladder. The engine note changed from a steady chuff to something lower and more deliberate, a sound that was less like a machine working and more like a living thing deciding. The chain hummed at a frequency you could feel in your chest before you could hear it with your ears. Then the Peterbilt moved, not much, an inch, maybe 2, but it moved in the right direction. Up and forward, not deeper. The clay around the rear tandems made a sound that Gary Benson later described as the most unsettling thing he had ever heard on a recovery job. A deep, tearing, sucking groan that seemed to come from below the surface of the earth rather than from the truck itself. 300 pounds per square inch of suction releasing its grip on 400 square inches of tire sidewall, all at once, in a sound like something ancient and reluctant letting go. Everett did not speed up. He did not change anything. He simply continued at the same pace, the same throttle, the same measured crawl, and the Peterbilt continued to come. 6 inches, a foot, 2 feet. The front steer axle lifted clear of the mud with a sound like a cork leaving a bottle, and a spray of black clay fanned out across the ditch bank. The trailer tandems were still buried, but they were moving now. Not spinning, not churning, just being dragged through the clay in a slow, inevitable arc toward the road surface. Gary Benson uncrossed his arms somewhere around the 2-foot mark. By the time the front axle cleared the ditch, his arms were at his sides. By the time the trailer tandems crested the shoulder edge and the Peterbilt's frame rails lifted clear of the ground, Gary Benson's mouth was open, and he was not saying anything. One of his younger drivers said Jesus Christ quietly to no one in particular at 9:41 in the morning, 48 minutes after Everett engaged the clutch for the final time. The Peterbilt 359 rolled onto the asphalt of County Road 14 under the pull of a 59-year-old Caterpillar tractor, and it sat there on 4 flat tires and a bent mud flap, intact, upright, and free. The beans were still in the trailer. The frame was straight. The engine started on the first crank. Everett shut the Caterpillar down. The silence after that engine stopped was the kind of silence that has weight to it. He climbed down from the machine, walked to the chain, and began coiling it. He did not look at the truck. He did not look at Dale. He did not look at Gary Benson or Gary's crew. He simply began coiling chain, methodically, loop by loop, the way a man coils chain who has coiled chain 10,000 times and sees no reason to do it differently, because something interesting just happened. Dale Mercer walked over to him. Dale was not a man given to visible emotion. He was a businessman, a fleet operator, a man who had built something from nothing through discipline and practicality. But his voice, when he spoke, was not entirely steady. He said, "Everett." Everett looked up from the chain. Dale said, "How?" Just that, how? Everett set the coil of chain down on the ground and straightened up and looked at Dale for a moment. He said, "Your wreckers were pulling against the ground. Every time they pulled, the ground pushed back and the truck went deeper. My machine pulls with the ground. The tracks don't fight the surface. They use it. And I changed your angle so the pull was lifting the truck out of the suction instead of dragging it through it. That's all." Dale stood there. He said, "Gary's wrecker has 3 times the horsepower." Everett said, "Horsepower is how fast you do work. Torque is how much work you can do. That machine has a final drive ratio that multiplies my engine's torque about 40 times before it reaches the ground. It doesn't go fast, but it doesn't stop." Dale looked at the Caterpillar. He said, "That machine is from 1928. Everett said, "I know." Dale said, "How is it still running?" Everett said, "Because I take care of it." Gary Benson walked over while this was happening. He stood at the edge of the conversation for a moment, and then he said, "Everett, I've been doing recovery work for 15 years, and I've never seen anything do what that just did." Everett looked at him. Gary said, "I mean that." Everett nodded. He said, "I know what you mean," Gary said. "What do I owe you for saving me from a week-long job?" Everett said, "Nothing." Gary said, "I'm serious," Everett said. "I know you are." He picked up the chain and carried it to the flatbed. Dale tried to pay him. He tried 3 times over the next 2 days. Everett refused each time, not with anger or false modesty, but with a simple directness that made further argument feel inappropriate. The 4th time Dale came to the farm, he didn't bring money. He brought a check made out to the Hardin County 4-H Foundation for $500 and left it on Everett's kitchen table while Everett was in the barn. Ruth Hassel found it and brought it to Everett and asked him what she should do with it. Everett looked at it for a moment and said, "Leave it." He never mentioned it to Dale, and Dale never mentioned it to him. Let me tell you about the years that followed, because the story doesn't end on County Road 14. Dale Mercer changed the way he thought about equipment after that Thursday morning. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the steady, cumulative way that a real lesson changes a person rather than just informing them. He started paying attention to things he had previously dismissed. Older trucks that had been maintained rather than replaced. Methods that were slow but reliable rather than fast and fragile. He kept a set of timber cribbin on his heaviest truck from that day forward, something Gary Benson had always done and Dale had always considered unnecessary. He sent his drivers to a recovery seminar in Ames the following spring, the first training of any kind he had ever paid for. And every October, when the ground got soft and the shoulders got dangerous, he drove a little slower on County Road 14. He told the story at the co-op, at the elevator, at the diner in Eldora. He told it the way people tell stories that change them, not to entertain, but to transfer something to make sure the lesson didn't stay private. The story got around Hardin County the way stories get around small counties, which is to say completely and permanently. People who had never met Everett Hassel knew his name after that fall. The parts counter at the co-op started seeing a few more people come in asking about older equipment. Whether that was coincidence or consequence, nobody could say for certain. Everett Hassel farmed his 320 acres until he was 78 years old. He turned the ground over to his son Robert in 1994, but he kept the machine shed, and he kept the Caterpillar, and he kept maintaining it with the same attention Harold had taught him 60 years before. He died in February of 2003 in the farmhouse where he had been born, at the age of 86. The obituary in the Eldora Herald ran 4 paragraphs and mentioned his church, his family, his years of service on the county extension board, and the fact that he had farmed the same ground for over 50 years. It did not mention the Caterpillar 30. Obituaries rarely mention the things that matter most. Robert Hassel gave the eulogy at the funeral. He talked about his father's patience, which Robert said was not a passive thing, not the patience of a man who waited for things to happen, but the active patience of a man who understood that some problems required time and that spending time on them was not wasted. He said his father had told him once that the difference between a good mechanic and a bad one wasn't knowledge. It was willingness to slow down. Robert said he had spent 30 years learning what that meant, and he thought he was starting to understand it. Dale Mercer sat in the 3rd pew at that funeral. He was 54 years old and had sold Mercer Grain Hauling 2 years earlier to a regional carrier out of Cedar Rapids. He sat in the 3rd pew and looked at the casket and thought about a Thursday morning in October of 1987 and a man coiling chain in the rain without looking up. Let me tell you about what happened in the spring of 2015, because the story doesn't end at the funeral either. Robert Hassel's son, Thomas, was 28 years old in 2015 and had been farming the home place with his father for 6 years. In April of that year, a drainage contractor named Kyle Reimer got a skid steer buried to the cab in a wet field on the north end of the Hassel ground while trying to clean out a tile outlet. Kyle was 34 years old, ran a 3-man drainage operation out of Iowa Falls, and had $180,000 worth of equipment and a reputation for getting jobs done on schedule. He had tried to pull the skid steer with his own track loader and buried the track loader to the belly pan. He had called a wrecker from Iowa Falls who had taken one look at the field conditions and told him he needed a crane. The crane company said 4 days. Thomas Hassel was watching from the field road. Robert came out to the field when Thomas called him, and Robert stood on the field road and looked at the 2 buried machines in the wet black ground and said quietly, "Go get the cat." Thomas looked at him. Robert said, "Go get the cat." Thomas drove to the machine shed and came back 20 minutes later on the Caterpillar 30, 87 years old now, running on an engine that had been rebuilt twice, with tracks that had been replaced once and repaired more times than Robert could count, painted the same worn gray it had always been. Kyle Reimer watched it come across the field from the road and said, "Is that a Cat 30? Robert said yes. Kyle said, "That machine is ancient." Robert said he knew. Kyle said, "I've got a track loader buried out there." Robert said he could see that. Kyle said, "No offense, but I don't think—" Robert said, "I know." He said, "My father pulled a loaded semi out of a ditch with this machine in 1987 when 2 modern wreckers couldn't move it." Kyle looked at the Caterpillar. He looked at his buried machines. He looked at Robert. He said, "Fine." Thomas rigged the chain the way Robert had taught him, which was the way Everett had taught Robert, which was the way Harold had taught Everett. Angle of pull first, mechanical advantage second, anchor point third. He took 40 minutes on the rigging. Kyle Reimer stood by the field road and checked his phone twice, and looked at the sky once and did not say anything, because he was a man who had learned something in the last 4 days about the cost of impatience. Thomas engaged the clutch. The chain came taut. The tracks pressed into the wet black soil of the north field and held. The engine note dropped to that low, deliberate register that Everett had always said sounded like the machine thinking. And the skid steer moved. An inch, then 2, then a slow, continuous arc up through the clay and onto harder ground, trailing mud and broken corn stalks and the smell of deep earth turned over. The track loader followed it out 20 minutes later. Kyle Reimer stood at the edge of the field and watched Thomas Hassel coil chain in the April mud and did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "How old did you say that machine was?" Thomas said, 87. Kyle said, "And it's never—" Thomas said, "It's never not worked." Kyle looked at the Caterpillar for a moment. He said, "What do I owe you?" Thomas said, "Nothing." Kyle said, "I'm serious." Thomas said, "I know." He loaded the chain onto the flatbed and drove back across the field toward the machine shed. The Caterpillar 30 is still in that machine shed in the northeast corner of Hardin County. Robert Hassel is 72 years old now, and Thomas runs the farm, and the machine has been maintained by 4 generations of the same family across 90 years of operation. The Caterpillar dealer in Iowa Falls has told them twice that the machine has no restorable value and no parts availability, and that they'd be better off putting it in a museum or selling it for scrap. The Hassel family has heard this advice carefully and done nothing with it, which is the Hardin County way of saying no thank you without starting an argument. The engineers who designed the Caterpillar 30 in Peoria in 1927 are all gone. The men who built it are gone. Harold Hassel is gone. Everett Hassel is gone. But the machine is still in the shed, and the chains are still on the hook, and when the ground gets soft and something gets buried in the black clay of Hardin County, the Hassel family still knows what to do. They go to the shed. They back the machine out. They take their time on the rigging. And they pull, because some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for people to remember why they were built. And some families understand that what they're maintaining isn't just a machine. It's the knowledge of how to use it, and the patience to use it right, and the understanding that the ground doesn't care how much your equipment cost or how new it is. The ground only cares whether you understand it. Harold Hassel understood it. Everett understood it. Robert understood it. And Thomas is out there right now in that machine shed, checking the tracks and greasing the fittings and keeping the thing running, because he understands that the day will come again when someone will stand on a county road in the rain with everything they built sinking into the earth, and they will run out of options, and they will look up, and there will be an old machine coming down the road on steel tracks, and the man driving it will say the same thing. His great-grandfather said, which is nothing at all, because the work will speak for itself, and the chain will go taut, and the ground will give way. And that's what happens when a family decides that some things are worth